Hi everybody, welcome to week 7, and this week we're going to continue to bridge the gap, I would say, between the constitutional era and then the works of Wilson and Goodnow to the modern era of public administration. And to do that, we're going to talk about Max Weber and Frederick Taylor a little bit and how they fit into this equation. So let me get right into that. Okay, so there was a short reading I gave you from Denhart, and I asked you to look at these issues in public organizations. And Denhart really is one of the experts in public organizations, and it's a really good work because it summarizes very briefly these 5 themes that he identifies as issues in public organizations. Now, you notice right away he starts talking about the politics administration dichotomy. I'm not going to talk about that, I promise. I am just going to talk about one theme that he points out, but I do want you to look at the rest of what he has to say because it is relevant. Um, the theme I want to talk about is this issue of can democracy and bureaucracy live together? And in that short section, you notice what he talks about is he asks this question of whether bureaucracy, as we characterize it anyway, can live within a democratic state. So we know we have at least a structural democracy in the United States. However, the stereotype of the bureaucracy is that it is undemocratic. So a classical bureaucracy is a top-down command and control organization, while a democracy really seeks to provide a structure in which all voices can be heard. So he asks whether or not our administrative structure should also be democratic. Um, and so is it possible for a bureaucracy to support democratic values while not operating as a democracy itself? And the question is, what values does a bureaucracy support? Is it efficiency? And in that case, we could stop there and say, is it efficiency only? Or should a bureaucracy also support effectiveness, representativeness, equity, economy, and can it represent all these values while operating as a command and control structure? Now, those values I put there are really important to keep in mind, not just for this course, but for the rest of your coursework, really. The issues are whether or not any administrative structure or organization support these values of public administration. And we can actually list more values of public administration, but we can at least list efficiency, effectiveness, representativeness, equity, and economy as important values in public administration. And do our organizations support these? These come up again and again, and the reason they come up again and again is really because they're often in conflict with one another. Uh, Equity and efficiency are often in conflict with one another. Effectiveness and efficiency are often in conflict with one another. So these are important points always to have in the back of your mind as you think about how public administration operates. So that's really all I wanted to say about the Denhart article. I want to spend the rest of the lecture just briefly talking about Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and a little bit on something I didn't have you read, but Henri Fayol. So let me continue with that. So Taylor and Weber are roughly contemporaries, both having lived and done their work in the late 1800s and early 1900s, along with Henri Fayol, whom I'm going to talk about in just a second. But Frederick Taylor is the father of what we call scientific management, which in essence is the development of a science, as he said, to replace old rule of thumb knowledge of workers. It's really an idea that there is one best way to do a task or a series of tasks. And it's the idea that you can establish an ideal ratio, really a truly ideal ratio of management to workers being at about 1 to 3 within any kind of industrial or production situation. And then Max Weber is known as the father of bureaucracy. And it's important to keep in mind right here when we say that, when we use that term, Weber didn't, well, Weber himself thought of the term as bureaucracy as an operative term, not as something pejorative as we know it today. So to call Weber a bureaucrat, he would not be insulted by that. But he thought bureaucracy was the most effective way to run an organization. I should say the most effective organization to use to actually produce results for industry and for society. And so it assumes a lot of things, primary of which is the idea that there are established and written rules that everyone within the democracy understands and abides by. So let me go into just a little more detail. This is going to be a shorter lecture today, but this will help you understand where Taylor and Weber fit into the scheme of things. So really, when we talk about Taylor, we're talking about the beginnings of organizational theory, and this will actually come up in readings next week and the coming weeks. But again, Frederick Taylor is this father of scientific management. So what he says really is that it's difficult, or if not impossible, to manage initiative and incentive in humans. But it is possible to codify the rule of thumb knowledge that craftsmen previously held in their intellect. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about the idea that if you were going to mass produce horseshoes, for example, you would want to be able to codify the rule of thumb knowledge that blacksmiths all had that wasn't written down, but you could actually take all that rule of thumb knowledge, you could query these craftsmen, and you could establish a set of laws or rules that could be applied by managers. And in doing so, the managers would be able to enforce this codified set of rules. So then it's possible to select the best workmen for the appropriate tasks. It's possible to train people to the task and then establish division of labor. And then it's possible for managers to orchestrate this work of the workmen in a precise way. And so what he says here is there is hardly a single act or piece of work done by any workman in the shop which is not preceded and followed by some act on the part of men in management. So the important link is managers in his theory, in his scientific management theory. And so Taylor actually began his thoughts not really as an academic or as a consultant. He really was a worker. He worked in a steel company, in a steel mill, doing finished steel products, and he eventually became a foreman. And he, in a sense, he started his scientific management as a foreman, roughly doubling the work productivity of his crews, and he impressed his bosses. And so he was actually trying in a practical way to gain maximum efficiency from his workers and his machines in his factory. And this is where he discovered his idea of doing time and motion studies to learn how to complete a task in the least amount of time. So his overriding value was efficiency of the man, the worker, that is, and efficiency of the machine. This led him to become a consulting engineer for many other companies. And it did lead him to publish this book called The Principles of Scientific Management, which was his most famous work and got him the most notoriety. So he came from the practitioner background, if you will, not the academic background. And so again, it's important to think about these 4 points because uh, they have relevance, I promise you, within how we think about bureaucracy and government work. So first of all, there is this scientific job analysis. That's the part where you gather data. What is this task? What is it the craftsman used to do? So you gather data and measure and determine the one best way to perform a job. That comes from codifying these rules, as I said. So this is how we're going to mass produce horseshoes, and here are the rules. It comes from selection of personnel. In actuality, Taylor thought that it was very important in the hiring process to actually understand the person you are hiring, because you want to hire the one best person for that task. It comes from the third principle is management cooperation. So managers do cooperate with workers to ensure the work is done in accordance with the principles. Um, in a sense, it's true that Taylor thought that humans possibly were not important. It wasn't as if he wanted to understand how the workers felt that day. But managers and workers did cooperate, at least in establishing the rules, so that the rules could be enforced. And that was the job of managers. And then finally, it's in functional supervising. So his supervisors in his scheme were understood the work. You didn't bring in supervisors who were clueless, if you want to use that term. They actually did understand the task at hand, and because they had a low ratio of supervisors to workers, and the point of supervisors was enforcement of the work rules. And by work rules, I mean the rules that establish the one best way to do a job. So these are the key points of scientific management. I will talk about the relevance to public administration in just a couple minutes here. But before we do that, we have to ask the question of why bureaucracy, the term that has come to take on really a lot of negative connotations. But to Weber, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, bureaucracy was an ideal form, really. It was an improvement. And I'll get to why that he said that in a second, but he defines bureaucratic administration as the control on the basis of knowledge. And he said that power is exemplified within organizations by the process of control. So really it was all about control of the work effort, control really of the governance effort. So there was definitely power within the bureaucracy in Weber's mind, but that power was really up front. It wasn't hidden. It was actually part of the way he thought a bureaucracy should operate. So he said that a bureaucracy is governed by fixed and ordered rules. Again, we're talking about rules. So this is similar to scientific management. He said that regular activities are distributed in a fixed way as official duties. So each position had a set of tasks to do. This sounds a lot like scientific management. He said the authority to give commands is distributed in a stable way and is strictly delimited by specific coercive means given to officials. What does that mean? That means that there is a chain of command, but that each link in the chain of command, and that would be an official from the very top official in the bureaucracy down to secondary managers to middle managers to first line supervisors, has a specific realm in which that manager can give commands. And finally, and most importantly, only persons who have specified qualifications may serve in the bureaucracy. So that sounds a lot like Wilson, and I will wrap all this up in a second. But it's important really to take Weber in context. So Weber is German. He grew up in the Prussian area of Germany, the Prussia area of Germany, as a sociologist. And he studied German society and German governance. And so when I say that he thought bureaucracy was an improvement on the older forms, what were the older forms? He thought there were three kinds of authority. He thought there was traditional authority, charismatic authority, and legal rational authority. Well, traditional authority, according to Weber, was what you would think of. Think in terms of that kind of authority exercised by monarchs and princes in Europe. Um, And traditional authority relied on an acceptance, really, of traditional rule by the people. Um, and whether that acceptance is rational or not, it's just a tradition. That is, in within an interlocking system of monarchies, there is a divine right of kings, and this tradition had continued for centuries. And so everything associated with monarchical systems and that tradition, um, that is, uh, monarchs, royalty, uh, the nobility, that was tradition in Europe. And it was accepted. Now, why was it accepted? Is there a rational reason it was accepted? Probably not, but it was accepted, and that was just traditional authority. He he compared that to what he called charismatic authority, that is, where one person uses personality to sway and rule others. Um, Ironically, of course, Weber's writing in the early 1900s, and it wasn't. It was only within a few decades that Germany experienced really the most negative uh, kind of example of charismatic authority that you could probably see, and that was Nazism. So he thought these two kinds of authorities were outmoded, and he thought that in modern society there there should be legal rational authority as the basis for operating government and society because it provided a foundation of legality um, for for society to go forward. And so this legal rational authority didn't depend on dynastic rule or arbitrary pronouncements. Um, and what he thought was that only a qualified leader should run a bureaucracy. So a bureaucracy was based in a legal code that could be established and that fixes power and has recognized authority. In other words, this establishes some kind of legitimacy. So the legitimacy of a bureaucracy was within its rational legal nature. So that is that there's this principle of fixed and official jurisdictional areas, which are generally ordered by rules, and that is by laws and administrative regulations. So again, fixed rules with a clear chain of command to enforce commands in an impersonal way. That is, commands aren't arbitrary. And then a method of qualifying individuals who occupy these positions of authority in the organization. That means some kinds of testing or qualification methods are imposed. So the Weberian bureaucracy has an understood hierarchy. It is a hierarchical organization. It has a recognized and continuous system of jobs within that bureaucracy, and it has recognized specialization within the bureaucracy. And this idea of impartial and impersonal enforcement and of and obedience to the rules is very important because each person in the organization is responsible and accountable for obedience to the rules. And if you break the rules, you will be punished. But that's done in an impartial way, ideally. So the manager of a bureaucracy, managers, but the top manager certainly, is not a part-timer. It's not the domain, for example, of a part-time aristocrat, which is the world that Weber came from, and it's important to understand that German nobility often was involved in government as just a traditional thing that nobility did. But he said that really they have no business doing that. What we need in bureaucracies are specialists. Um, they there is a public-private split. There is no mixing of their duties in a public bureaucracy, for example, with the other businesses or anything else they're involved in. There's a split of the finances of those things. And finally, this is a career for a person. So the head of a bureaucracy, this is what this person does as a career. It's not an avocation. It's not a part-time job. This was very important to Weber. I'm going to draw this together after I talk about Fayol for just a second. But Fayol was a contemporary, roughly, of Weber and Taylor. So Taylor, the American, Weber, the German, Fayol is from France. He also came from the practitioner side. He worked in coal mining, and he wanted to recognize the idea that there were management principles, and he was really the first to identify management as this continuous process of evaluation, and that is that there should be principles that all managers abide by. So he said there were 5 management functions: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. Okay, so these are going to come up again. These are going to come up again next week and the week after when we start talking about Luther Gulick in the United States, who really was influential in helping to define administration, the administrative management school of thought in the United States. But these 5 functions, Fayol said, these are things all managers do at any level. They're responsible for planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling at their level. And they did that through 14 principles. So every organization had these principles that could be applied. So first of all, there was division of work, right? This principle fits in nicely to scientific management and into the bureaucracy. There is authority and responsibility. That is the right to give orders and the power to extract obedience. Again, this is a principle that can easily be seen in bureaucratic organizations. There is discipline, again, which relates back to the specific rules. Unity of command, which is there is a vertical unity of command from the top person in the bureaucracy down to the bottom people, but that every person understands who their supervisor is. So an employee receives orders only from one supervisor because that particular supervisor is enforcing the rules that are written, but the rules that are given by the supervisor above that level. So that implies unity of direction. That is, that direction is established at the top and flows down. There is a subordination of individual interest to the general interest. So in a sense, a bureaucracy is a collective. That is, within the bureaucracy, no one's really interested in what the lower levels have to say. It's not as if they're not human, but the group interests take precedence. There is remuneration of personnel. And that sounds obvious. People get paid, right? But that wasn't necessarily a principle that everyone thought of. That people should be paid fairly for the job. And it's important to recognize that Taylor, Weber, and Fayol all thought, yes, workers should be paid for the work they do. Centralization as a principle of management. So, meaning that managers are really the responsible ones to complete their tasks. Okay, that little blip. So, the last several, scalar chain, which means there's a chain of command, ultimately from the ultimate authority to the lowest person, right? There is order, which actually implies something we still practice, which is you're not going to be productive if workers have to wait for parts, for example, with which to do their work. The supplies and people have to be in the right place at the right time. Today, we would call that just-in-time logistics. Equity. That is, managers should treat employees fairly and equally. This sounds a lot like what Weber is talking about in a bureaucracy, that rules are impartially and impersonally enforced. Stability of tenure, which implies that we should seek long-term commitment from managers and employees. Initiative, which sounds a little different than what Taylor was talking about, that employees should be encouraged to develop and carry out improvement plans, and esprit de corps. So really, this final one almost sounds a little military, and it's interesting to say that because, any military is a classic bureaucracy, but the point is that people actually are enthusiastic about working for the bureaucracy. So I just put this slide right here because we're not going to talk about Luther Gulick this week, but the thinking of Taylor and Weber and Fayol really were predecessors of Luther Gulick's thinking. They were deeply influential in Luther Gulick, and by extension, deeply influential in the way we structured bureaucracies in the United States, with the emphasis on principles that could be applied at all organizations and in various organizational forms, with the emphasis on hierarchy and specialization, with division of labor, and with coordination of work through span of control, through one boss, through technical efficiency, and through this scalar principle, that is the chain of command. So here's the bridge part. Wilson and Goodnow talked about a specialized corps of administrators. And they talked about the need for a specialized corps of administrators really to replace the somewhat ineffective, inefficient, and sloppy spoils system that had been talked about by Andrew Jackson, but really had been used within federal workforces and really state and local workforces for a whole generation or more. They said administration needs to be professionalized. Well, then if you say that and you accept that, how do you professionalize that workforce? Well, the way you do it is through establishment of vertical bureaucracies which carry out the work of government. And how do you form these bureaucracies? Well, you form these bureaucracies within the rules of Weberian thought. Weberian thought about bureaucracy. And how are bureaucracies run? Bureaucracies are run based on a set of rules. And how do the workers produce results? They produce results really based on the scientific management principles that Taylor came up with. And so the classic bureaucracy is a scientific management organization in which workers are the one best person to do the one best task within that organization. They are Weberian in thinking because they are in a bureaucracy which features a clear chain of command and rules, and they're like Fayol in their thinking in that managers really abide by principles of management. And so this is the bridge really that was supposed to produce the kind of government effort that Wilson and Goodnow envisioned, and leads to really the modern era, if we want to term it that, of public administration in the early 1900s. So that's it. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments on the discussion board this week. Thanks very much, and as always, please contact me with any concerns.